Grief Stories is not a crisis resource. Please seek support from a qualified professional in your area to meet your unique emotional and medical needs. You're listening to the Grief Stories podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Pollard, a social worker with an interest in helping people find hope and healing when someone they love has died. In each episode, you'll hear a conversation with a guest, sharing their story and insights about what can help when you're adapting to loss. At Grief Stories, we're helping grief make sense, one story at a time. Today's guest is Missy McLean, a registered social worker and community organizer working with people who are impacted by the toxic drug crisis, homelessness, and poverty. Hi, Missy. Welcome to the Grief Stories podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Maureen. Thanks so much for inviting me.
At Grief Stories, we've been thinking a lot lately about the idea of community grief. And I know that you're very active in our community. So, we're really grateful for you to be coming on and talking with us about this concept of grieving in community, losing a community member and grieving together. So I would like to invite you to share a little bit about your experience moving in our community with the kind of loss that ripples through when we lose someone in a sort of public way, or a member of a community. Maybe the story doesn't always go public, but the community knows.
Sure. So when I was thinking about this, there were two experiences that sort of came to mind for me right away, and they're bit diverse. So the first one was when I was the supervisor of a warming room, which is like a respite space for folks who are homeless in the community here in Northumberland County a few years ago. We lost a member of the community who was very much a part of that and connected with folks who were using the warming room space. And I remember being in this big room with all of these, vulnerable community members who were just in their varying journeys of survival that winter. And the news came through a friend of mine in the space, and it sort of started rippling through the room that this person had passed. And I was really struck as I was looking at folks as they were processing this and thinking about the ways that because of their sort of social locations as marginalized community members who were experiencing homelessness, many of these folks are people who identify as people who use drugs and are just in sort of really are pushed to the margins of our community in a lot of ways, that their grief and their experience of this loss of their friend was really neglected by the larger community. I was standing in this community center and I was looking at all these folks who had lost a close friend in this way that sort of touched them in so many different ways. If when someone dies from a toxic drug poisoning, it hits people who use drugs really hard, because we know that in this moment, the way that the toxic drug supply is, that it's like Russian roulette every time folks are using to a certain degree, and that's for a lot of reasons that we can talk about. But it's a marginalized grief. It's what's the word I'm looking for? We have a term for it, like a disenfranchised grief.
Disenfranchised. Right? Yeah.
A disenfranchised grief. And so I was thinking, like, wow, if we were in this space and this was a group of students, let's say, and they had lost one of their peers, we would see the parachuting in of grief counselors, of crisis workers, of people to wrap around these students and to acknowledge their loss and sit with them in their pain and work with them on strategies to, process their grief and how they're going to cope with this loss and all of these things. And how many crisis workers and grief counselors were brought to the community center to sit with the folks who lost their friend? Like not one, right?
Not one.
Not a one.
Yeah.
Not a one. Um, and I've seen that neglect and that disenfranchised grief play out in a lot of different ways in our community, especially working with folks who use drugs, who use criminalized drugs, I should say, and who are experiencing homelessness, where they lose someone who is so close to them, right? Because a lot of the folks, when they are street involved and they're using criminalized drugs, they are each other's family. They are each other's network of support and survival. And so those losses, they cut deep, but they're not recognized in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So,
it's one of those things where, because of their struggles, because of the pain that they're in, and because of the ways that they cope with that pain, it's easy for people to other them and to distance themselves and dehumanize. Right?
Yes. Yes.
And so when any population is dehumanized, then we forget that they also grieve, that they also feel pain and fear, and we become distanced enough from them to be afraid. And that fear interferes with providing the human kindness and compassion that we would for any other group of people.
Dehumanization is exactly the experience. You captured it so perfectly. Thank you for putting words to that. That's exactly what happens with so many of the folks that I'm connected with in that I'm in community with. And I see that play out in exactly that way in every aspect of their lives, including their grief. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then you said that you had a second story that came to mind as well.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this one is quite different. So this one, it was the community that I would associate it with is a community of families who are all, whether we know each other personally or not, we have a thread that connects us. And that thread is having a loved one who lives with a diagnosis of a severe mental illness and also has interactions with law enforcement. And so this was a number of years ago. I heard on the radio about the death of a man named Suleiman Fakiri. This is a man who lived with schizophrenia, and he was killed by correctional officers while being detained in the Central East Correctional Center, awaiting a hospital bed. He was in a mental health crisis, and instead of being taken to a hospital, he was taken to a jail. And after a sequence of events, he ended up dead in that jail because of the treatment at the hands of these guards. I have a loved one who lives with a diagnosis of a severe mental illness and who comes into contact with law enforcement in times of crisis. And I felt the grief of this loss of this man, Suleiman, in such an intense way that really it took me out in a way that I wasn't anticipating. And I thought, I don't know this. I don't know him. I've never met him. I don't know his family. And yet I was part of this community. And I actually, learning of his death in that way led me into becoming more connected in this community, and specifically with his family and with his brother Yusuf in particular, because I felt compelled to reach out to this family and to offer my condolences, my whatever I had to offer, right? And I've become part of this community of families impacted by the criminalization of mental illness. And so these are two instances where, different moments, different ways of learning about the grief, different proximity to the person who had passed, different proximity to the people immediately impacted. But that's really what came to mind when you said you wanted to talk about community grief.
Mm-hmm. And both of them are such good examples of the ways that, we can think about people in grief. We think about it as a series of concentric rings. And so in the center are the immediate survivors, So Suleiman's brother, Yusuf, for example, right? Yeah. And in the first example that you gave, really all the people in that little community were in the center. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me. And so and then moving out from there are the people that know about the situation and are somehow connected to it. So that might be, family, friends, acquaintances who don't know the person personally, but know the people in the center circle, right? Yeah. And then a little bit beyond that are folks like yourself in Suleiman's case, where you didn't know them at all, but were touched by it because of your own circumstances and experiences and reached out and became connected, offering support.
Yeah.
And, in some ways that was missing, that element of people outside of the circle reaching in to offer support in that first story that you shared, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I think, when I think about community grief, I think about those rings, the concentric rings of survivors and how they're impacted at different levels in different ways and how the ripples go out through those rings. And sometimes they're big waves and not just ripples in the center, right? Mm-hmm. And they ripple out. But I think some of the pieces that we think about in community grief are, how does the news of a death get out? How does it come forward? Who hears about it?
Yeah.
And what are the boundaries around privacy versus information sharing? Because that all impacts everybody in the community that's affected.
Yeah.
How you hear about the death and what gets said about it. And so, often in the cases of folks who are using drugs or have serious mental health issues, or where there's overlap, because there often is, then what we're looking at are people who are almost viewed by portions of society as being disposable.
Yes.
Because that dehumanization process has taken place.
Yes.
And so we have these public statements that get made that diminish and dismiss grief over people that were loved.
Yes, hugely. And we see, we can look at examples from, tragedies across the country where we see the implications of race and racism, right? When there is like a mass casualty of a say like a bus accident, we've seen instances where there has been an overwhelming outpouring of national grief, and then very little to nothing for another, similar circumstance, but the identities of the people who were in that vehicle, whether they were seniors versus youth, or they were racialized versus predominantly white, impacts the way that the larger community grieves and names and speaks about those deaths.
Mm-hmm. And I think, that causes some real challenges for folks who are surviving and grieving after the death of someone that they love. And some of it is that their feelings aren't validated. And that comes for folks living in marginalized communities. It often comes in the wake of survival where they're already not validated or valued.
Yeah.
And so it really can compound things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you're talking about that, I'm thinking of, just the process and act of crafting an obituary for someone. We've seen, in the time I've been working in this space of working with folks who are directly impacted by the toxic drug crisis and their friends and family members who are grieving deaths, I've seen a shift towards more public expressions of the circumstances of those deaths, but there's still so much shame, so much stigma associated with those kinds of deaths that do see that it's omitted from the obituary. and then other times you see it very clearly stated, and that's with great intention on the part of that family or friend, that they want people to know, and they're doing it's a real act of resistance against that stigma and shame to say, no, I want people to know that this is what happened, and I want people to associate my loved one's death with, the failure of politicians or policymakers to take action on this drug crisis, just as one example.
Right. And also, I think those statements and obituaries say, yes, this person had challenges and they were loved.
Yes.
And I think that at the heart of it, it's the love that we want to shine over and above whatever problems we have during this life as humans.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, we know that it's challenging to grieve in community, to experience the loss of a community member, and to just sirens going by. They'll have to edit that out.
No problem.
I don't know if you can hear that.
I could hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I manage to not be talking when they go by and can just mute myself. Yeah. Anyway, Sean will take this part out. So what was I saying? I was talking about how difficult it is. So we have a death in a community, and we have people trying to adapt to that loss while they're still undergoing such hardships. And their loss is basically diminished or dismissed. Yeah. So the challenges become difficult. And it also becomes difficult when it is so evident that some community losses are valued more than other community losses. And the newspaper stories and the what goes across all of the social media channels and all of the comments that follow really highlight those discrepancies between which humans are valued in community and which ones are not.
Yes.
Which brings its own aspect to the grief, really, right?
Yeah.
So we know that community members die and community members mourn those who are past. And we also know that community members come together in grief, and that can be healing. And so when we think about that kind of healing and the possibility of healing in community, what has been your experience of some of the things that have helped folks find their way to adapt to the loss and to come together and heal in community?
Such a good question. Immediately, I think of the public gatherings and vigils that I've had the honor of participating in to commemorate the passing of someone in community, and the way that taking up space visibly in public, whether that was a conscious decision or not, but because of when I'm thinking of this one community member in particular who passed in a public space, we gathered as a community of folks grieving him. We went to that space, and and that deciding to go to that actual location meant that we were publicly grieving, right? On a public street, next to a pub where people were, having a drink after work and all these things. It just was the reality of it. But I think that there was strength in that. There was healing in that act because it brought people together. It showed folks that they weren't alone, and it validated what they were feeling in that public way. And I think there was strength in people taking up space in the way that they were that night. And we did it again on the 1-year anniversary to demonstrate. And again, it wasn't about the first purpose wasn't about demonstrating their grief to the community, but it was sort of like a secondary effect of going and gathering in a public area and crying together, speaking about this person that so many people loved, remembering remembering him, putting his picture up, having, offerings and medicines and candles and all of these things as part of a display in his honor. And there was strength in that, in what you were saying about, always emphasizing and wanting the lasting effect to be acknowledgement that this person was loved. That is what that vigil really offered to folks, was this public visual representation of his friends and family's love for him. And then being able to leave it there. We left the photos and the flowers and the candles and the messages were then left there, and people were really respectful. And I think it actually, when you talk about that ripple out into the greater community, I think that visual had that effect, in that for days after, I was seeing people stop, pause, look at the photos, and really think about, what did it mean for this young person to die in this way, in this space, and to reflect on all of the circumstances if they had, read a news story or heard about it, by word of mouth in the community. It was really powerful. And for the people who loved him, it was just a really beautiful way to connect with each other and to demonstrate their love in that way.
Yes. I mean, I really think that I remember that I was at that one, and I feel like, it humanized the person who died, and all of his friends who were also struggling.
Yeah.
And it showed his family the love that was held for him.
Yeah.
And it showed the community, the greater community, that he was loved. And ultimately, at the heart of it, that's what we all want, is to know that we're loved and made some impact in this world with our being and being loved. And so that ability to gather together, to do so publicly, to do so freely, to express yourself and be heard and witnessed in your grief is so powerful in community. Yeah,
absolutely.
So a vigil or a memorial is one way to do it. Are there other ways that you've experienced people coming together where, they have the opportunity to process grief in community that might not be as, focused as a vigil or a memorial?
Yeah. One of the other examples that's coming to mind for me is, folks gathering as part of, say, a peer support group or a grief circle, which is a smaller, more private sort of gathering of community members. And typically, they don't know each other, except for, again, sort of what I felt with the Fakiri family is that this connecting thread of experience, so I facilitate a peer support group for people who are grieving the loss of someone to a toxic drug-related harm or death. The majority of the folks who come to this circle, they didn't know each other before they came to, we call it Healing Hearts, Northumberland. They didn't know each other. And so they found community in this group, a new community where they are able to speak about their loved one, process their grief in different ways. We talk about, we do all kinds of different activities. We do what we call like a memory dip, where we pick something like food, and then we write for 5 minutes about a memory of our person that we've lost and food. What is a memory? What's the first one that comes to mind, right? Because there's so much focus on the loss, but we also are really trying to make a conscious, intentional effort to remember and celebrate those happy memories and those poignant memories and the ones that we carry with us. So a grief group can be another type of community and another way to process grief.
Yeah, I love that writing exercise, the memory dip. I think I do a lot of work in therapeutic writing, and that's such a great prompt, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's, whatever it is, food or music or parks or whatever, right? That's lovely. And I also, to your point about creating community in grief, I run groups for survivors of suicide loss and homicide loss. And in a similar way, people who are living with stigma related to the death, and sometimes related to the life that happened before the death, and all of those pieces. And the opportunity to hold a grief circle or a support group is that ability to help create community among people who understand this path, right? Whether it's someone who's lost someone to the toxic drug crisis or suicide or homicide or, other types of specific loss that groups might form around. That element of peer support, in my experience, is so powerful that the community created out of it really allows people to know they're not alone, that their story is unique, but it fits into this space or experience of many other people.
Yes. Yeah. We always talk about how each person's story is unique and yet they're the same, right? They're unique, but same.
Yeah.
When a new member joins the group and they start to talk and I look around the circle and so many heads nodding, so much recognition of the experience, of the feeling, of the emotion, of the struggle, all of it. And when the new member sees that recognition, like feels that validation, sees that the folks that they're talking to, they get it. That's what that's the other language that it's so nice to be in a space where people just get it. And I don't have to explain, or I don't have to defend, or, it makes a huge difference.
All of that, right? And it's that sometimes with disenfranchised grief and stigma that's attached to the kinds of losses and lives that some people are living, that element of being understood and accepted is so critical.
Yeah.
In terms of finding some healing.
Yeah.
I think, to come back to that idea of the writing exercise, sometimes some of the projects that help in community in terms of healing also involve a lot of work with expressive arts. And that could be a group project, like a community mural or sculpture of some type, temporary or otherwise. And but it also could be community coming together and creating art in parallel. So each person is making their own art, but they're doing it in community. And there's beauty and value both in the group projects and in the individual projects done together.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're making me think of the purple chairs that we paint for International Overdose Awareness Day.
Yeah.
That we've done where, we come together as a group. Each member of our grief group paints their own chair purple, which is the color associated with overdose awareness, or toxic drug poisoning awareness. And then we display these chairs on August 31st, which is International Overdose Awareness Day, as a collective. And then folks also adorn their chair with different mementos representing their person. So photos, messages, letters, clothing, like a favorite sweater, something like that. And that has been probably one of the most powerful pieces that we've done together.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's that, expressive arts are really powerful in the way that they give opportunity for movement of feelings when there are not words sometimes.
Yeah.
Or when there are words, but they need movement in song or poetry, to flow, because the statements are too harsh, too hard, too much, right? And so we make this art that makes beauty out of pain, and allows people to have a place to explore their feelings, express their feelings, and be witnessed. When we produce any kind of art and we hold it out to the world, we're also letting ourselves be witnessed in that, And I think that a big part of community in grief is that witnessing.
Yes. Yeah. Hugely.
Yeah.
And that's been the experience for members of the grief group too. I'm thinking a couple of the members have written poems about these are moms specifically who have written poems about their children. And then, and they've said to me afterwards that they never would have thought that they would get up in front of a group of people and read these poems or speak at all about the loss of their child. But at International Overdose Awareness Day, when we have the vigil in the evening, these moms have read their poems aloud in front of the community that's gathered together. And it is that witnessing, it is that channeling of their love and grief into words, and then, just creating it as an offering to the community so that the community can bear witness to their grief, but also it's an invitation to the community to learn more about their loved one, to learn more about them, and to just find a different way of connection as well. It's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. It has the ability to bring cathartic relief to the person who writes the poem and then shares it.
Yeah.
And it also has the ability to allow the audience members to really connect with the feelings and the experience. And that's so powerful because it lets audience members know they're not alone, or it opens a deeper understanding of the experience for people who didn't know before. Yeah. And so there's so much that happens in community that doesn't happen, for example, of course, when we're alone, but also even in individual therapy, one-to-one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a place for individual therapy. As a therapist, I have to believe that. But but I also think that the power of community is really important.
Yeah.
In so many ways, when there's a community member lost, or when we're feeling alone in our grief.
Yes. And those acts, those rituals, and those expressions, they can range the whole emotional spectrum, right? Like, one just came to mind for me right now that's pretty like silly and joyful. And that's, my friend group, we lost our friend Giacomo a few years ago, and he was a runner and always do like the reindeer run before the Santa Claus parade. And so a group of community members, of friends of his, continue to do this reindeer run in their silly Christmas costumes every year. And that is a way that each year they, that he's always with us. He's always with the folks who are running, but it's a different way of connecting with him, is in this silly, fun run every holiday season.
Yeah. And he is held in community by his community, witnessed by the larger community. Yeah. Right. And so, we know that grief that impacts a whole community, however a person dies, when it's a public death that becomes known across the community, it impacts so many people. But also the healing can come from that connection of so many people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that we didn't talk about community grief that is on your mind that you want to touch on before we finish? Or have we pretty much covered the things we thought we would feel were important?
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We did.
I guess, my one hope, especially when it comes to the drug crisis and the ongoing deaths that we're experiencing there, is, people typically have pretty high high regard and compassion and conduct themselves with a certain amount of respect when it comes to people dying and lives lost. But again, like we've been talking about for the last while, when it's certain kinds of stigmatized death, it really goes out the window. And so my hope is that like more and more people will just find a way to approach, let's say a toxic drug poisoning death, even with, I want to say, curiosity about that person.
Yeah.
Right. And that you said it, that drug use was one part, one small, I would argue, small part of a person. And so, before shifting to whatever preconceived notions we have about someone, whatever assumptions we want to make about that person and who they were and how they lived and, how they treated people, to really call on your curiosity instead, and to listen to the folks who knew that person and who loved that person and get to know that person in a new way, even if it's just for a minute, even if you're just walking by a display on the street.
Yeah, I like to kind of identify that as compassionate curiosity, right?
Perfect words.
Yeah, like it's that sense, not just of curiosity in a nosiness kind of way.
Yeah. Oh,
right. But compassionate curiosity where we're rehumanizing those who've been dehumanized.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to steal that. Compassionate curiosity is exactly it.
Yeah, I use it all the time, right? We want to, I teach social service workers and I talk to them about compassionate curiosity all the time. Every time someone's in front of us, if we approach their story with compassionate curiosity, we learn so much about the person, about what's important to them, about how they are in the world, and it really helps us see humans as as a full human.
Yeah.
Their whole story.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Grief Stories podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Pollard. Please remember that grief is universal, but every person's experience of grief is unique. While our interviews are intended to help listeners feel validation and reassurance, we realize that these stories may be different from your own. Please visit our website, griefstories.org, for more stories of hope and healing.